السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، ناصر المستضعفين، قاهر الجبابرة الطواغيت الظالمين، الذي جعل العاقبة للمتقين والعدوان على الظالمين، والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد، اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا وزدنا علما وفقها في الدين يا رب العالمين. It's a slightly delayed start today, but inshallah we benefited from the nikah ceremony that took place. And as we start the 12th session, as always at the beginning we pray that Allah Azza wa Jal alleviate the suffering of our brothers and sisters in Gaza. The 98th day is today, almost 100 days, and we must continue to remind ourselves of what is taking place and continue to make dua and all the efforts that we can. In the same way we made the efforts in the first week, we need to continue to have the same level of passion, the same level of action in order to assist and help our brothers and sisters. May Allah Azza wa Jal enable us to keep up our efforts and enable us to strive to our full capacity to assist our brothers and sisters. Ameen. So as always, inshallah, we'll start with a quick recap of what we covered last week. So mainly we covered two main topics. We covered the Munich Olympics incident that took place in 1972. We covered it in much detail. We won't go through it today. There was an attempted, so it was a hostage taking of the Israeli team in order to free some of the Palestinian prisoners. Eventually it didn't go as was planned. The hostages were killed in the firefight that took place with the German police and army. The hostage takers, a number of them were killed, 3 of them survived, and thereafter they were released. That's in summary, but we covered it in detail last week. And thereafter many of the countries started up with their anti-terror operations, etc., and task forces. Thereafter we covered the Yom Kippur War, as it is known in English, or as it is known as the Arab world, the War of the 6th of October, or the Ramadan War, which was started on the 10th of Ramadan or the 6th of October 1973. And this was an attempt by Egypt to gain back the Sinai desert, which had been occupied by the Israeli military in the previous war, in the 6-day war in 1967. So it's now been occupied for 6 years, more than 6 years. And we went through the military details of the war. So we discussed the peace offer that was rejected. Thereafter we talked about the plan that was there to attack King Hussein of Jordan, informing the Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, with regards to the impending attack by Syria and obviously Egypt, and the arms that were being given by both sides, the US to Israel, the USSR and the Soviet Union to Egypt. And thereafter the initial advance of the Egyptian troops and the Syrian troops in the Golan Heights, and thereafter the turn of the war where the Israeli army pushed back onto the western bank of the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, and pushed back the Egyptian forces and advanced within 100 kilometers of Cairo, and in the same way they were within 40 kilometers of Damascus. So we covered the military details last week. Inshallah, today we'll start off by covering the political background and the other impacts that took place before, during and as a result of this war. So first of all, we'll discuss the peace offers. So before Sadat, before Anwar Sadat, we had Jamal Abdel Nasser, And we discussed Jamal Abdel Nasser in the previous wars. So when he died in 1970, Anwar Sadat became the ruler of Egypt. And his way of running the country was slightly different. And from the start, he proposed peace treaties with Israel. Now, to understand the situation in Egypt at the time, Egypt had been going through a very rough patch economically. The country was at an all-time low in terms of morale, etc. Obviously, especially after the 6-Day War in 1967. The Sinai Desert is occupied, the economy is in trouble, etc. Anyway, so Anwar Sadat, he made a number of proposals. So he made a proposal in February 1971. He made another proposal in February 1973, and the proposal was that Israel withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula, and Egypt can return back there. They don't mind if it's demilitarized. Maybe UN troops can be monitoring on that side as they were previously. And in return, they will sign a long-term peace deal with Israel, and he offered that. And he also offered to open up the Suez Canal, because now the Suez Canal has been closed to any Israeli ships and shipping to go through. And as we are seeing today as well, through Bab al-Mandab, which therefore means the Straits of Tiran and the Suez Canal are currently closed for shipping to Israel. So that was his proposal. So in 1971, Golda Meir actually put it to a committee, and the committee came back within the Israeli government, and they said that, look, in terms of our strategic interests, it makes more sense for us to withdraw to the pre-1967 borders, so to the map that has been drawn up at that time, and to let Egypt have the Sinai Peninsula, and to give the Palestinians those areas if they are willing to recognize and normalize relations with Israel and sign a long-term peace deal, because that means we won't be at conflict with them. She sacked the whole committee and said, I'm not happy with what the committee has, what the committee has come to in terms of a conclusion. So she refused the peace deal. Henry Kissinger, the one who died recently at the end of November, he was in the US circles, one of the main individuals who was communicating with the Egyptians as well as the Israelis, and he was running around the world discussing. He eventually, before this war, he became basically the one who was in charge of running all of the affairs, because President Nixon was involved in the Watergate scandal that took place at the time, and also the end of the Vietnam War. So while the president was involved in those things, he was busy sorting out all of the US's diplomatic relations around the world, similar to what Blinken is doing at the moment. So that was Henry Kissinger's role at that time. Same thing in 1973, in February, proposed another peace deal. Israel again rejected. Well, actually the US pressured Israel more this time, because they thought that it would be advisable for Israel to accept the peace deal offer. Israel came back and they gave a counter offer, which was unrealistic. They said, no, we will maintain control of the Sinai Desert. Or not all of it, but at least portion of it, like maybe 50% or whatever, or maybe more. It will still stay under our control, and it will not be demilitarized from our end. Obviously, this was not going to be acceptable. So that was on the Egypt-Israel ties in terms of peace treaty. On the other side, you had Egypt ties with the USA and the USSR. So we discussed this briefly last week as well. So initially, a lot of these Arab states, so Egypt, Syria, etc., they were aligned with the Soviet Union. And that's obviously during the Cold War. On the other side, you have the USA and the Western Bloc, as it was known. So the Egyptians, or Sadat, when he came to power, he sort of fostered relations with King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. And obviously Saudi Arabia had strong ties with the West and with the US. Then they were more aligned to the US than they were aligned with the Soviets. And especially as they received help in order for them not to, in order the balance of power due to the influence of Nasserism, as it was known, Jamal Abdel Nasser, meaning unity of all the Arab worlds with one leader, who Jamal Abdel Nasser wanted to be that leader. So they already had ties with the US. So when Anwar Sadat was made closer ties after the friction that they previously had between Saudi and Egypt, they started a discussion of let's get closer to the US. So in order to do that, unilaterally Sadat, he dismissed about 16,000 advisors, political, military personnel who are in Egypt back to Russia, back to the Soviet Union. The US said, why are they giving, their statement literally was, why are they giving us this for free with nothing in return? They just sent back 16,000 home back to the Soviet Union, and they expected us to give something without asking anything for a promise. So the US just ignored what he did in July 1972. This obviously infuriated Sadat. He wanted the US to pay attention to him. So very soon after, he goes to war with Israel and he attacks Israel. After this, he starts a purchase of weapons from the Soviet Union. He purchases airplanes, he purchases tanks, he purchases weapons. And so he bolsters up his military and gets prepared to invade Israel. The myth that is generally said by the Israeli media and the Zionist narrative is that the Arabs on the 6th of October on Yom Kippur in this war, they wanted to annihilate Israel, wipe it off the surface, wipe it off the map and destroy Israel. Mainly Syria and Egypt, but then obviously, as we said, there were a few troops from Iraq and a few other countries. Now this is a myth. The war was mainly by Egypt and Syria to take back their own territories which had been gained, as we discussed last week. They were only trying to take back the Sinai Peninsula from the Israeli forces and the Golan Heights. That's it. In fact, there was no even attempt to go to the West Bank or even to enter Gaza. It was simply the borders of Egypt and the borders of Syria. So that's a myth that that their plan on that war was to totally annihilate Israel, because that wasn't even on the initial table for discussion. They wanted to return to the pre-1967 borders, and this is what we always hear in the news: the pre-1967 borders. Now, once this war started, obviously the relationship between Egypt and Saudi had strengthened. So in discussions, King Faisal had mentioned to Anwar Sadat that we may do an oil embargo in order to assist in this war against Israel. So what happens is that the states, Egypt and Syria, they invade or they attack the Israeli forces who are occupying their land. Henry Kissinger is going back and forth, speaking with Israel, speaking with Saudi. He is told by the Saudi minister in the US that if you bolster up Israel and their army and you support them, we will, the king is looking at doing an oil embargo. They brushed it aside. Anyway, as the days go on, initially they say, okay, we will cut down 5% in production of oil and will increase the price of a barrel of oil. So they slightly increase the price, decrease the production. The US then promises the Saudi ambassador in the US that we will not aid Israel. We will not aid Israel to such a high extent. But the same day or the next day, the president then Israel asks the US for $980 million worth of military aid. $980 million. Now the president, who has his own scandal back at home, to turn eyes away from the scandal, he passes through the Congress $2.2 billion worth of aid. So more than double what was requested by Israel. And the Saudi ambassador, when he goes back, he says to King Faisal that the president is more interested in something to do with somebody thieving something. He doesn't exactly understand the whole thing, but his literally words are, they are worried about some theft more than what's happening here in the Middle East. So, or the oil embargo. Anyway, so he approves 2.2 billion. Now, initially the Saudis did not want to do an oil embargo. In fact, there were other countries like Iraq and Libya who were pushing for an oil embargo, and Algeria. They were saying we should stop oil exports. Saudi was saying no, we should not stop the exports, and we can just decrease by 5% just to put a bit of pressure on them. However, once the Congress approved the $2.2 billion military aid to Israel, as a knee-jerk reaction, the next morning, as soon the same day, the news reached. Obviously, Libya the same day said we'll do an embargo. The next day in the morning, King Faisal ordered the 9 o'clock news in the morning to announce that there is now an embargo on all exports to all of the countries that are aligned with Israel in this war, and that included the US, included France, included Netherlands, included Japan, included the UK, and it also included other countries later on, like South Africa. It was under apartheid South Africa at that time, Rhodesia, so modern day Zimbabwe, and a few other countries. Anyway, so they do this embargo, and this embargo continues until March 1974, which is when the Israeli troops who had crossed the Suez Canal onto the western bank, eventually withdrew to the east bank, so back to where they were before this war started, which was in March 1974, and that's when the embargo stops. However, as a result of this embargo, oil prices in the West skyrocket by 300%. A barrel went from almost $3 to $12 per barrel. The price skyrockets because at that time the US was mainly relying on exports of oil from the OPEC countries, which is the organizations of the Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries. That's what it stands for. So, majority of the exports, over 80%, came from these countries. And Saudi Arabia at that time was producing 25% of the world's oil. And so this had a massive impact on the economy, and this led to the recession that took place from 1973 to 1975 in the Western world, and the economic boom in Saudi and the other countries as a result of this embargo. Anyway, so once the embargo comes to an end, there are also assurances given by the US to Saudi. They agree to provide Saudi with some assistance. They give them military aid and agree to sell US weapons. As long as the Saudis agree to work with the US, they will give the Saudis some their weapons. And so this deal is signed in 1974, agreed to in 1974. Also similar to Egypt, they start discussing with Egypt in order for them to normalize ties with Israel. They provide Egypt with economic aid, military aid, and in response what happens is they come to an agreement. A Sinai agreement is made first of all on the 4th of September 1975. So in 1975, the agreement is that Israel will withdraw about 20 to 40 kilometers away from the Suez Canal. So it will withdraw deeper into the Sinai desert, and UN forces will patrol the area in between the canal and where the Israeli forces have withdrawn to. And this was all in conjunction with Egypt and the Egyptian government, who agreed to this arrangement, and in response they got the aid from America, military aid, and also economical aid, which until now continues. The aid every single year, millions of dollars are provided in aid to the Egyptian government. So after these events, we have a number of events that take place from 1974 to 1978. We'll cover the key events that took place. So on the 27th of June 1976, we have what is known as Operation Thunderbolt or Operation Jonathan. So what happens is the Palestinian group, so the PLO and the other groups, they are still continuing their cross-border attacks, mainly now from Lebanon, and then within the borders of what is Palestine with what they can. There's not much that they can do within the occupied territories because they are living under basic military rule. So mainly the attacks are coming cross-border from the north, mainly from Lebanon, a bit from Syria, but mainly from Lebanon. On the 27th of June 1976, two Palestinians and two Germans, they board a plane that was heading from Tel Aviv to Paris. It stopped in Athens. Two Palestinians and two Germans, they board the plane and they hijack the plane. They then eventually get the plane to land in Uganda. Uganda at that time is ruled by Idi Amin, which for those of you who know the history and have heard of the history, Idi Amin is a notorious famous individual in Uganda, known for a number of killings, etc. But that's a separate history. So Uganda was supportive of the PLO and the Palestinian resistance forces. So he enables them to come to his soil, and he also gets his forces, a number of 100 soldiers, to come and welcome the plane and protect the plane. And they land, and they have over 200 passengers on the plane. However, not all of them are Israeli citizens. So over a period of 7 days, eventually, the non-Israelis, who are 148, they are all allowed to fly back and set free. The remaining 94 Israelis and 12 crew members of the plane are kept as hostages. And as in return to release those hostages, they ask for the freedom of 53 prisoners, 40 of them held in Israeli prisons and 13 held in other prisons in other countries. So they want to swap the 94 Israelis and the 12 crew with 53 Palestinian prisoners. Israel refuses. So they have a discussion first. Shall we agree to their demand? Shall we not? Because they threatened to kill those hostages if they didn't. So they decided that no, what we'll do is we will do a rescue operation. We'll do a rescue operation. It was initially called Operation Thunderbolt. So they sent a number of commandos at night and fly them quickly to Uganda to attack. And they were prepared to fight the Ugandan army also. So they sent 100 commandos. And they land. Now remember, there's only 4 hostage takers, and the rest are all hostages. So 106 hostages, if you include the crew. They go there, firefight takes place. Obviously, there's only 4 of them. There's a number of Ugandan troops who are there. So 45 Ugandan soldiers are killed. 25% of their air force is bombed and destroyed. The Ugandan air force is bombed. And the hostage takers, all 4 are killed. 3 of the hostages, 4 of the hostages are also killed, and 102 are rescued. But the commander of the operation, his name was Jonathan. He was killed, and a number of other Israelis were wounded. So later on, they renamed this operation as Operation Jonathan, as he was the commander of the operation who was killed. This Jonathan is the elder brother of Benjamin Netanyahu. Jonathan is the elder brother of Benjamin Netanyahu, so he was killed in an attempted hostage rescue operation. If that has anything to do with what's happening today, Allahu A'lam. Anyway, so that was that event that took place in 1976. And thereafter we have in 1977, so on the 20th of November, we have Anwar Sadat, who has made this the agreement with Israel. He then, the peace treaty initially, after the war that takes place in 1974, 1975, he's getting closer and closer in ties with Israel. He then visits Israel and he makes a speech in the Knesset. And as part of the speech, it's not a very lengthy speech, but a few paragraphs of his speech. Part of his speech, he says that we want to work towards a just and stable peace, durable and just peace with Israel. He also says that we welcome you to live among Israel has now become a reality in the region, so we welcome you. And this is not just, he claims to speak on behalf of all the Arab states, and he says this is not just to do with Israel and Egypt, but on behalf of all of the Arab states, we would like to have a durable and just peace, and we welcome you to live amongst us in peace and security. And he does put a few caveats afterwards, but that does not mean that you can continue to take Palestinian lands. You need to withdraw to the pre-1967 borders for us to have this durable and just peace. So this is the first visit by an Arab leader to the official visit in this capacity to Israel, and a speech in the Knesset. Obviously, the King Hussein of Jordan has been visiting Israel from previous. And as a continuation of this, in September 1978, we have the Camp David Accords. Now you will most probably all have heard of Camp David. So this was in America. It took place from the 5th to 17th of September. We have Jimmy Carter, the President of the United States, Sadat, and we have the Prime Minister of Israel, Begin, and they come together to discuss, Jimmy Carter is trying to broker a peace deal between Egypt and Israel. And this marks a major change in the events that then take place afterwards in the region. So they discuss peace and they come to an agreement. They come to an agreement in these 12 days, 12, 13 days, they come to an agreement. And in this couple of weeks, what they decide is that Israel will withdraw from the Sinai Desert. They will withdraw from the Sinai Desert. And this takes place eventually in a slow withdrawal of Israeli troops. So it happens in stages, staged withdrawal, and eventually the last Israeli troops, withdraw from the Sinai Desert on the 26th of April, 1982. So in 4 years' time, they have withdrawn. And this agreement is signed on the 26th of March, 1979. So on the 26th of March, a few months later, they officially sign the agreement once the terms and the details have been agreed upon, and this agreement is made official. So as part of this agreement, number one is that each of the states will recognize each other. So Israel recognizes Egypt and its borders. Egypt in turn recognizes Israel and its borders. So this was the first recognition of an Arab state of the state of Israel. There will be normalized relations. So the normal relations, as they are between any countries, will be between Egypt and Israel. At the same time, there will be peace. So they will be regarded as being at peace with each other and not at war. Whereas initially the Arab League had decided that all of these countries are in a continuous state of war with the state of Israel because of its the incidents that had taken place since 1948. And it also meant that they will open up the Suez Canal, the Straits of Tiran, to all of the shipping and movement for Israeli ships. There will be no stopping. Also, Israel will not assist any attacks on Israel or take part in any of the attacks on Israel, etc. So these are the main points that were there. Also, the Sinai Desert will be a demilitarized zone. So Egypt, although it will belong to Egypt, Egypt cannot put any military outpost or a single soldier in the Sinai Desert. And as a result of this, although they came to some agreements later on where they allowed a few soldiers to come and station themselves by Sharm el-Sheikh when the Egyptian government was threatened, also when there was a bit of rebellion on the border of Egypt and Israel from 2011 onwards. In a few incidents that took place over the past decade, they allowed, within the agreement, with the discussions, they allowed some of the Egyptian troops to go closer to the border. But generally, this whole region, the Sinai Desert, as part of this agreement, would be totally demilitarized. Not a single Egyptian soldier would be allowed to enter this zone. And what that meant was that Egypt could not object to any of Israel's plans or ambitions in the region. So if Israel decided to attack, for example, Syria or Jordan or Lebanon, the countries it borders with, Egypt would be obliged by the treaty to maintain its peace and its bilateral relations with the state of Israel. It also meant that they could not assist the Palestinians. So they cannot help the Palestinians or any of the Palestinian groups. And eventually, as a result of this, Egypt was removed from the Arab League at the time, after a couple of years, and Anwar Sadat was seen as a traitor to the Muslims and to the Arab world, and he was eventually assassinated on the 6th of October 1981. So these are the main events that took place between the years of 1974 and 1978. Thereafter we have the Lebanon front. Now mainly until now we've been talking about Egypt, Syria, Jordan. Not much has been discussed about Lebanon. Now Lebanon was a very volatile state, especially after the Second World War. The state wasn't very stable. We had a large portion of the population before 1948 were Christian with Muslims, but after that, obviously, we had about 400,000 Palestinian refugees living in Lebanon, and then who had been displaced from 1948. Thereafter, the PLO and other organizations came from Jordan and through Syria and settled in Lebanon. So Lebanon had, you could split it, they had a number of different categories or types of people inside the country. So they had the Christians, they had the Druze community, they had Sunnis, and they had Shia. And not all of them were in agreement with each other. And so the Christians who had held mainly leadership roles in the government initially, they were allied with the US and with the Western Bloc. The Shia communities, the Palestinian communities, obviously they were not allied with the Western Bloc because they were the supporters of the State of Israel and the existence of the State of Israel and the reason for them being refugees. So they were all allied with the Eastern Bloc or the Soviets, as was Egypt. And that's where they got their assistance from. And so the situation was always precarious within Lebanon. The government was never very strong, and although they had governments from 1948 onwards, the government was always generally very weak. Eventually, the PLO now is continuing cross-border attacks from Lebanon into Israel. Every so often, attacks take place. They kill some border guards, they kill some Israeli policemen, someone from the Israeli military, etc. The attacks continue. And many of the international attacks that took place, the hijackings, etc., they were launched, or it was easier for the Palestinian resistance to fly from Lebanon and to plot or plan these attacks from Lebanon. Because obviously Jordan was not possible. Egypt has now signed a deal with Israel, and Syria wasn't really willing to host many of these organizations at that time, except a couple who they had support for. But a majority of all these organizations were in Lebanon. So Lebanon was, you could say, the headquarters of the Palestinian resistance. The government of Lebanon went through different stages. And eventually what happens is that there's internal strife, an internal war that breaks out in 1975. Now, the background to this, obviously there are many different factors, but to put it in a nutshell, we have a government crackdown on protesters, which then leads to some of the protesters being killed, which then leads to riots, etc. We have the leader of the Christian groups in Israel, in Lebanon, the Maronite Christians, who are being supported by Israel. They take over a number of towns. Now, the southern part of Lebanon, which is the border with Israel, that area there was actually mainly Shia and Palestinians or Sunni Palestinian refugees. The Christians were more north. So the Israeli state had a problem, because if they were to look at the north border, that was posing now for them the biggest threat. They had adversaries right on their border, and their allies were north of them. They were allied with the Maronite Christians. So what they thought was, why don't we make a plan where the Maronite Christians will support them to come and take over these southern areas, so that they can be a buffer between us and any of these forces who are hostile to us, the Palestinian resistance, basically the PLO and the few other groups there. And this plan of taking over Lebanon, etc., in the grand scheme of things, was also an idea of the founders of the State of Israel. So, for example, Ben Gurion, in 1948, just after they had declared their state, he said that the Achilles heel of the Arab coalition is Lebanon, and Muslim supremacy in this country is artificial and can easily be overthrown. And he, in 1948, said that a Christian state should be set up on the southern, with the southern frontier on the river Litani, meaning on the border of Israel. And then we sign an alliance with this state, and we will have broken in this way the Arab coalition, and they will not be able to do anything from Lebanon. So now Lebanon will belong to us. Thereafter, we'll bomb Amman. We'll wipe out Transjordan. After that, Syria will fall. And if Egypt still dared to make war on us, we'll bomb Port Said, Alexandria, Cairo, and we'll end the war, and we'll put paid to Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Transjordan. So this is what he said in 1948. He had the idea of taking over, if you remember, the greater Israel, so the whole region. And so in 1954, another proposal that was put forward to Moshe Dayan, who, if you recall, he was the defense minister. He said, Moshe Dayan, he said the only thing that's necessary is that we need to find an officer, not even a major, in Lebanon. And we don't need to win his heart. All we need to do is pay him and buy him with some money. Get him to agree to declare himself as the savior of the Maronite Christians, as savior of the Maronite population. And he will then start fighting against the Palestinians and the Muslims in Lebanon. We, as the Israeli state, will declare ourselves to be the saviors of the Maronite sect in Lebanon, and thus we will enter to help these Christians who are being persecuted and terrorized, and we will then make a Christian regime in Lebanon who is allied with Israel. And this was in 1954. So as you can see, the rhetoric continues. 1948, 1954. In fact, in 1954, Ben Gurion just said in plain words, Israel should provoke Lebanon's Muslims to attack Lebanon's Christians in the hope of igniting a civil war in Lebanon. And as you can see, the civil war came into full being in 1975. And And by this time, the Beirut, for example, was a Muslim majority, as well as the south of the country, etc. And we had an individual called Sa'ad Haddad. Sa'ad Haddad. And he was the head of the Christian movement in Israel. And he was a major in the Lebanese army. And so he had allied with the Christians of Lebanon with Israel. And he was provided arms, equipment, everything by the Israeli government. And what he did was he began to occupy the Muslim villages. He began to occupy Muslim villages across the border of Israel and Lebanon. So he begins to occupy Muslim villages across the border. And this eventually leads to a war, internal war between the Muslims and the Christians in Lebanon. Anyway, on the 11th of March 1978, 8 Palestinians hijack a bus that's on its way to Tel Aviv. So what they do is they go by sea, they land, so they leave Lebanon and they go through boats and they land on mainland Israel, go to Tel Aviv, which is not far from the coast, and they hijack a bus that's on the way to Tel Aviv. Again, they hold the bus, they hold the hostages in the bus, and they demand that the hostages, that the Palestinian prisoners are released in exchange for the release of the hostages. Again, Israel declines to agree to this exchange. Instead, they try a rescue mission. However, in the rescue mission, what happens is that there's a gunfight. And in the gunfight, the 8 Palestinian hijackers are killed, as well as 34 Israelis. So another botched up hostage rescue operation. 34 Israelis are killed, including many of those who are on the bus. This is a provocation. And so on the 15th of March 1978, Israel invades Lebanon. Israel invades Lebanon in response to this attack. So they invade 20,000 troops, and they start to support the forces of Major Haddad, who we just discussed, Sa'ad Haddad, to pillage the Palestinian camps that are on the border of Lebanon and Israel. And eventually the area that the Israeli army takes over, they hand over the area to this Major Haddad. And they tell him, you can rule this area now. So this is on the border of Israel. And they provide funding, they provide training. In fact, even previous to this, they used to bring the forces of Major Haddad into Israel and train them in Israel to go and fight against the Muslims and the Palestinian forces in Lebanon. So they were trained, supplied, and funded by the Israeli government. After this incursion, eventually there's a number of initiatives for there to be a ceasefire or some kind of peace deal between the PLO and the Israeli government. Eventually this is brokered by the US in July 1981. In July 1981, that there will be no cross-border attacks, etc. This, however, does not stop the Israeli government from planning to forward their interests in Lebanon. So they're still trying to meddle in the affairs of the Lebanese government. Although now there's a peace agreement and the PLO is not doing any cross-border attacks into Israel during this time. So Sharon, who was still a major player at the time, we already discussed him a number of times. He goes to Lebanon, and what he does in January 1982 is he meets an individual called Bashir Gemayel. And Bashir Gemayel, he is a presidential candidate in the presidential election in Lebanon. And he promises him, and he gives him a lot of money, he gives him financial aid, he supports his his campaign to run for president, and he also promises him an invasion, and they come to an agreement that if he becomes the president of Lebanon, Israel will invade Lebanon and get rid of the PLO and get rid of anyone who tries to oppose this new president. So this agreement is made between Sharon and this individual. Now, the PLO at this time, because of the peace agreement, they're not really provoking Israel in terms of any cross-border attacks. So what happens is the government of Israel, they really want to take over Lebanon because the PLO are strong, and that's the main resistance. If they can get rid of the PLO, destroy the resistance in Lebanon at this point in time, they have basically got rid of all the resistance. They then ask permission from the US that we want to invade Lebanon. Can you let us do it? So the US General Haig, so in mid-May 1982, he says to Ariel Sharon that basically you cannot invade Lebanon without any provocation. Okay, so what he basically said was, you have the green light to invade Lebanon. However, if you act without provocation, then the impact will be devastating. So what you need to do is provoke the PLO to do an attack on Israel, and thereafter you can invade. That's basically the message that was given to Israel. Don't invade without any provocation. So make the PLO do an attack, thereafter you can invade. So this was in mid-May. It so happened that the 3rd of June 1982, a group which is called the Group of Abu Nidal, which still exists today. Abu Nidal, we've discussed this group in brief previously as well. It's not a major group in that sense, but we discussed them previously. He was one of the leaders of one of the groups who was killed by Israel. They assassinated the Israeli ambassador in London. This is on the 3rd of June 1982. So immediately, this is the opportunity that Israel was looking for. Now, Abu Nidal group is not the PLO, and there has been no attacks by the PLO on Israeli soil. And so it's got nothing to do with Lebanon. However, Israel immediately goes to war the next day. So on the 4th of June, they enter into Lebanon, 200,000 troops, they bomb Beirut, and they start bombing all over Lebanon. And on their way, they carry out a number of massacres, a number of slaughtering, a number of camps are destroyed. For example, one of the incidents was in Ain al-Hilwa, where the Israeli forces, they surround the refugee camp, and they promised all of the occupants who don't bear arms that they won't be harmed. But again, this was something that the locals and the Palestinians had become used to now since 1948. You get promised that you won't be harmed, but as soon as you give yourself up, you're killed. And as they are true to their practices, the Israelis, over 7 days, they killed each and every single individual in the camp. They killed every single man in the camp until they killed the last man on the 14th of June 1982. Now at the same time, obviously, you've got Syria. Now Egypt and Jordan, they don't need to worry about. But you've got Syria and the PLO groups that are still there. The Egyptian troops, the Israeli troops are now closing on Beirut. They're getting closer and closer to Beirut. Now Beirut is the capital of Lebanon. If they take over Beirut, they've occupied basically the whole of Lebanon. So on the 11th of June, they sign a ceasefire with the Syrians. Now, in the civil war that took place, the Syrian government was siding with the Palestinian resistance groups. So they were on the side of the PLO. And so they were seen as hostile by the Israeli government. However, the Israeli government signs a peace deal with them on the 11th of June. Previous to that, on the 8th of June, the Prime Minister of Israel, Begin, who is the same one who signed the peace deal with Anwar Sadat in Camp David, he said, we are not interested in the war with Syria. That's on the 8th of June. 11th of June, he signs a peace agreement. 4 days later, they attack the Syrian armed forces. Similar, on the 13th of June, in fact this one's even worse, on the 13th of June 1982, the Prime Minister of Israel, again, he stands up and he's making a televised address. And he says, we have no intention of invading Beirut. He finishes his speech, and he sits down. There's no chair, he sits down. He sits down, and immediately as he says, we have no intention of invading Beirut, by the time he sits on his chair, the TV is broadcasting images of Israeli tanks in the streets of Beirut. And so in this way they also enter into Beirut. And in this now, initially when we discussed the foundation of, or the establishment of the Israeli state and the Zionist movement, etc., we said that initially they were very secular. They weren't really very religious. But as time went on, the religiosity of the state increased and increased. And as we said, initially they weren't fully supported by all the Jews around the world. However, the number of Jewish support for Zionism, the increase in the number of Zionism as they won war after war, the 1948 and thereafter the 1950s, the 1967, the Six-Day War, 1973, Yom Kippur War, even though there was an initial loss in the first few days, they were seen as being, no, this is the promise. And so many religious Jews, especially from Eastern Europe, many from Russia particularly, and other countries, in Poland and Ukraine, they all started coming to the state of Israel. And this increased the number of, or the religiosity of the population and also of the army. And so we have the rabbis now being involved in this war. So for example, they made statements that they cannot overlook the biblical sources and instructions with regards to this war, meaning the war against Lebanon, and our presence here, meaning the presence of Jews in this country. We are fulfilling our religious duty as Jews by being here, and it is written the religious duty to conquer the land from the enemy. So now they were increasing there was an increase in religious rhetoric within the state of Israel and within the army and the instructions to the armed forces. And at the same time, obviously now we have the PLO who are in Lebanon, and the Israeli force has been continuously bombing, a huge bombing campaign, slaughtering campaign in the whole of Lebanon. So Yasser Arafat, who's the leader of the PLO, as we've already discussed, the founder and the leader of the PLO, in July, so a month later, on the 2nd of July, he informs the president of Lebanon that he will evacuate. So he'll evacuate Beirut. He'll evacuate Lebanon so that Israel doesn't have the justification to continue his bombing campaign and his invasion of the country. But despite him willing to or putting forward this option, it didn't make any change in terms of what was taking place on the ground. So on the 2nd of July, he makes his proposal. On the 9th of August, Israel bombs Beirut with 36 sorties, so 36 bombing campaigns, just on the 9th of August. On the 10th of August, 16 bombing missions on Beirut. On the 18th of August, 72 bombing missions on Beirut. So this bombing just increases. It doesn't decrease. There's no hold up in the bombing campaign, and this even caused a stir in the US, who had given them initially the green light, but now the bombing was just continuing, even though they had taken or basically entered into Beirut by this time. And so even the US said that this is unfathomable. We cannot continue with this amount of relentless bombing. And so they demanded that the Israeli military force stop this campaign of continuous bombing in Lebanon and specifically in Beirut. In this time, we had number of casualties in Lebanon was between 30 to 50,000. Between 30 to 50,000 people were killed, Palestinians, Lebanese, etc. And in the fighting, the numbers differ, but approximately 500 plus Israelis were killed in the fighting. But this is compared to almost 50,000 Lebanese and Palestinians who were killed in this war. This then led to a number of events that took place after this. Inshallah, we can continue from this point next week. But the incidents that we discussed today had a significant impact on the events that took place later on. So the Camp David Accords, the peace agreement between Egypt and Israel, the normalization of ties, the first Arab state to recognize Israel, thereafter Israel's involvement in Lebanon in an attempt to create a satellite or a puppet state and government there, which caused civil war and caused a large number of deaths in Lebanon, which then led to a number of agreements that took place between the PLO and Israel in the following years. Inshallah, we'll cover those events that took place next week, inshallah ta'ala. Today, before we finish, if there are any questions with regards to these incidents, inshallah. Any questions? No? No questions today. Alhamdulillah. That's fine. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jal enable us to understand the events that took place, enable us to then make the correct decisions based on the understanding of these events. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jal rectify the ummah, rectify the leaders of the ummah, guide the ummah that will take us from strength to strength and bring back peace and prosperity in the Muslim world and bring freedom to our brothers and sisters in the blessed lands of Masjid al-Aqsa and the Sham and Al-Quds. And we ask that Allah Azza wa Jalla alleviate the suffering of our brothers and sisters, remove the oppression and the current bombardment of our brothers and sisters in Gaza and also in the West Bank and the occupied territories. Remember that while the oppression continues in Gaza and the bombing is relentless with military invasion, at the same time the Palestinians living inside the 1948 borders, which is known as the State of Israel, they are living under military rule. And even if we may not hear, because not much news is possible to come out, but their lives are very difficult. So we ask that Allah Azza wa Jalla also makes things very easy for them. And in the West Bank, I'm sure you will all be following the news of how on a daily basis, on every night actually, on a nightly basis, the Israeli army invades town after town, refugee camp after refugee camp, destroying roads, destroying sewage systems, imprisoning many of our Palestinian brothers and sisters, destroying their homes, etc. So we ask that Allah Azza wa Jal assist all of our brothers and sisters. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jal also assist and relieve the suffering of our brothers and sisters in Sudan and wherever else our brothers and sisters may be around the world. Ameen. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. جزاكم الله خيرا. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.